Welcome, everyone, to Nerd of the Rings. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, author Ian Nathan. Ian has covered such film directors as Ridley Scott, Tim Burton, Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, as well as writing books on The Terminator, Alien, Fantastic Beasts, and of course, the one that we will no doubt reference the most today, Anything You Can Imagine, Peter Jackson and the Making of Middle-earth. Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very much a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'll start off with the very beginning here. How were you first introduced to Tolkien and the world of Middle-earth?
I think my story is probably quite a familiar one. I was probably about, 10 or 11 years old, and I was at what we call primary school in the UK. And we had a shelf of books at the back of the classroom. And I'd read, I think, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and been very taken with it at that age. And alongside where all the Narnia books was this book called The Hobbit, sitting beside it. And I'd kind of flicked through it and seen, I don't think it was Alan Lee pictures. I think it was actually the Tolkien original pictures in it. It was that edition, going back a few years now. And I eventually, I think I got my mum or someone to buy it for Christmas, and was totally taken with it. At the age of 11, it's a wonderful book, and that lovely kind of bedtime story feel that it has, The Hobbit. And through that, I looked, the front pages, and I learned there was a thing called The Lord of the Rings. And I thought, well, it's a sequel. And obviously at 11 or 12, you're imagining a book like The Hobbit Part 2. Of course, Lord of the Rings isn't The Hobbit Part 2. It's a grown-up book in many ways. It's vast. And I had to get my head around the fact that it was 3 different books and it was one story and all those kind of complicated things you have to try and understand. And I remember I had my pocket money, and I was in a bookshop, and I bought a lot of books at that age. I saw The Two Towers, and I wasn't smart enough to realize that wasn't the first part. It was the middle part. I bought The Two Towers, and then I figured out it wasn't the right part of the Lord of the Rings to have. So I think for a couple of years, I just had The Two Towers on my shelf. And then finally, I think I got to about 14, and I kind of got the stamina, and I kind of took the deep breath, and I kind of plunged in. I had a copy of the book by then, and it must have taken me, I don't know, a year to read. I suppose there must be an interesting kind of survey you could do amongst readers of the Lord of the Rings to work out what are the points they surge ahead, and what are the points they get a bit tired. I think you get to the Council of Elrond, and then you slow down a bit because it's such a big chapter. And I know that the writers, Philippa Boyens and Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, felt that as well as they were writing the script. It's such a hurdle to overcome, Council of Elrond. And then you get Mines of Moria and all that stuff, so it quickens again. And then I think you get to, I have such clear memories of this, sort of Riders of the Rohan around about then, and it all kind of slows down again because there are longer chapters. So it's a journey of a book to go on, but it was a wonderful journey, a really significant one, as life would prove to be. And I kind of went through that phase, 14, 15 years old, of once you read Lord of the Rings, you just went looking in the fantasy section of the bookshop and read Moorcock and all the kind of greats and all the not quite so greats. And by the time I discovered girls and going out and trying to be cool, I kind of left it behind a little bit. And then if we cut forward to the fact I've become a film critic and journalist after university, and I joined a magazine called Empire. Which is a very big film magazine in the UK. And I many years, spent 20 years on Empire. But during my period on Empire, I learnt, or the whole staff learnt, that there were these rumblings that a serious attempt was going to be made on adapting the movie. And being quite high up in Empire at that time, I kind of what we call bagsied it for myself. I went, whatever the territory is, I'm going to occupy it. This is going to be my baby, whatever comes of this. And I held on to that, tightly, and I managed to cover the films for the magazine. So it was kind of a wonderful chance to kind of re-embrace my 14-year-old self and that wonderful journey I went on. I'd read the book several times in the interim. And I read it again, obviously, just as the film sort of went into production. but it was just a chance to sort of rediscover that little part of my brain in which all the characters still lived and all those incredible locations with, the memories of Hobbiton, the memories in my imagination of those places, the mines and all those kind of things. It was all still there. And it was fantastic to kind of let it all live again.
Absolutely. And I love that, as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm currently making my way through the book. I'm probably a third of the way in. And one thing that'll no doubt be a delight to Tolkien fans is you spend a good chunk of time talking about Tolkien himself and the previous attempts to adapt even before Peter Jackson. And you give quite a bit of background there, and I can say as a Tolkien fan, we kind of dodged some bullets there.
It's a strange world, actually, and I mean, in sort of setting out to do the book, anything you can imagine, I kind of started with one policy. I was not going to write a book about Tolkien. I wasn't going to write a book about swords and elves and magic rings. I mean, there are fantastic books out there on these subjects covered. I was going to write a book about crazy New Zealanders who wanted to do the impossible, to adapt this, Everest of a fantasy novel. But obviously, you kind of want to set up the idea of how impossible that is before you show how it was achieved.
Yeah.
So what I did was I started to explore. I knew about Ralph Bakshi. I'd seen Ralph Bakshi's attempt at the cinema, and I had kind of vague ideas of John Borman's attempt, and I knew a little bit about this story about the Beatles wanting to make it, and these were kind of myths. And I kind of, and in covering the films for Empire, I'd kind of explored a bit more of those and talked to people about them. But I hadn't really gone into huge amounts of depth about the various attempts made. And once you start sort of chipping away, you realize there was this kind of industry of people who attempted to do it, and how the rights passed through Hollywood is a fascinating story in its own right. I mean, Tolkien sold them when he was still alive. He sold them to United Artists. It had various dealings with different producers who would come back to him with proposed screenplays. It's all in the book, but it's sort of, and they drove him mad. He turned to this phrase "sillification." And it's just because he said everything became Disney. He loathed Walt Disney. He loathed Snow White and all those things. And he feared that his book would be turned into a Walt Disney style film. So anytime he got sort of proposals and screenplays that said silly things about enchanted castles and clouds and unicorns, it just got his ire up and he became furious. He was quite canny. I think I got out of that, just studying it, was that I think he got Hollywood. He knew how to operate with it. He knew the deal, and he said it in his letters. If you read them, it's cash or kudos. You can sell out to a Hollywood studio and lose your influence on what comes out, or you kind of try and keep the kudos. You try and keep it close to home. And there were various radio adaptations for the BBC and all these things that were done. And then I think he wanted to fund his grandchildren's university education. It was as simple as that. And he wasn't yet, enjoying the spoils and riches of the book success. So he just sold the rights to UA to fund that. He sort of let go of it and said, well, do what you will. And obviously the legacy of that was huge. There was various complications with what the Hobbit would be and who could do the Hobbit. Silmarillion obviously didn't exist as a book at this point, so it wasn't part of the deal. There was no sense of any TV rights with that. It was just film rights. But what's fascinating is within that, and I've seen the original deal, is that whoever owned the rights that Tolkien sold were allowed to make any sequels they wanted. They could take those characters and do something with them that's entirely not of Tolkien. So Warner Brothers, who now have those rights, could easily do a sequel to Lord of the Rings and just make it up. I think they understand that might infuriate a lot of people. But I bet there are meetings at Warner occasionally where they go, well, we could go back in, there's money in this. If this Amazon thing doesn't work out, maybe we go back in and we find out what happened to Aragorn and all these characters and revisit. I don't know if that's happening, but it's perfectly permissible as regards the rights.
It certainly wouldn't be surprising. I mean, like you said, I'm sure there's been a conversation where it's come up at some point, and thus far, cooler heads have prevailed, I guess. uh,
Yes, it's a dangerous territory, but
yeah.
studios are well known for entering dangerous territory. So
Right.
who knows?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I had never heard before reading your book the John Borman uh, treatment, the proposed script for that adaptation. And I won't spoil it here, but I will say, if you're interested in it, it's for all those who are afraid that the Amazon show is going to be, kind of turned into a Game of Thrones copy. This has got some aspects that are very Game of Thrones ish.
Yes.
So yeah, you should expose yourself to at least the highlights to know how big of a bullet we dodged with that one.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I've read that script because Peter Jackson had the script.
Mm,
His manager, Ken Kamins, was the manager of John Borman as well. So they
yeah.
had a connection. And he got the script and he gave me a copy of the script. And it's mad. I mean,
Yeah.
Borman, if you've seen Excalibur, you'll have an idea of
Mm,
kind of where John Borman was coming from. And he did get the novel down to a kind of workable level. It's a 3 hour
mhm.
film, I think he proposed in the end, but it's full of sex. It's full of this kind of
Yeah.
rather hippie-like ideas about
Yeah.
spirituality, and it's full of mad humor, really mad humor. There's very sort of John Borman, but if you're a Tolkien fan, it would just make you
It
scream.
would
It's
drive you crazy. Yeah. So what then was your first experience with Peter Jackson's films? Obviously, you had the immense burden of as you were working for Empire to
yeah.
cover these films. What was your first experience covering those films?
Well, I'd seen The Frighteners, and I'd seen Heavenly Creatures, and I liked Heavenly Creatures a lot. I sort of came around to The Frighteners a bit later. I'm not sure I liked it that much first time, but like a lot of people, that film kind of grew on me.
Mm,
And then I'd done some of the exploration of the early sort of splatter films. So I was a bit kind of like, who is this guy they've given this book to? Is he really the right guy, as a lot of people probably did at the same time? And my first encounter with Jackson in terms of interviewing him is Cannes in 2001. And I don't know if you kind of know the order of events, but obviously they were shooting still. And there'd been a lot of bad press about what was going on in New Zealand. They'd started up these films, and everybody thought it was just mad, real kind of Heaven's Gate style, catastrophe. It's going to destroy New Line. It was just the most ridiculous project ever launched. Everyone knew this book was impossible to adapt.
hmm
I think the whole background with Harvey wasn't helping. I think he was kind of
Right.
maybe sending out some poor rumors into the industry.
Mm,
So what New Line very wisely chose to do was, as Michael Desky, the executive producer, said, change the conversation. They needed to lift people's spirits as regard how good this film was going to be. I mean, they'd seen the footage, they'd seen what was going on. None of the rest of us had any idea. Well, there'd been a little bit of a teaser trailer, but no one really knew exactly what was going on out there. So
yeah.
they decided to do this preview in Cannes, which was in May before the December of the release of Fellowship of the Ring. And it was going to be a big press event, and they'd do interviews, a big party, all this was going to go on. But there was still a lot of frowns and skepticism. And I remember, I'd been very excited because I was kind of, at Empire, our ethos was always, we wanted films to be good. We didn't want films to be bad. We
hmm
wanted people to go to the cinema. That was where we came from.
Yeah.
So, we were all just on the side of the Lord of the Rings being great, and we were worried, but we wanted the new Star Wars. We wanted this to be fantastic.
Right.
And so we were upbeat, but we were scared. And I remember waiting to see the 25, 26-minute bit of footage they took to Cannes. Outside is this small backstreet cinema in Cannes called the Olympia. And it was me and about sort of, I don't know, 10 other journalists sort of huddled by the doors very quietly at 10 o'clock one morning. It was rather overcast for Cannes. And I just clear memories. And the doors were locked for some reason. Someone had forgot to open the front doors, and we're all kind of pressed up against the glass like zombies. And clearly we were all like 14-year-old boys, wanting to get in to see this footage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And of course, very, very famously, it was an astonishing bit of preview. And it was just, in an instant, that changed the whole conversation on Lord of the Rings. It was just fantastic. The majority of it was the battle with the cave troll in Moria.
Mm,
That was kind of the
okay.
backbone of it. And there was kind of two montages either end, one
Mm.
sort of Hobbiton-y and fellowship-y at the beginning, and then incredibly there was footage from all three films at the end,
Oh,
including stuff that
really?
never made it, that was redone and
Mm.
fixed. Just a taster of all three films, and it was just fantastic. It was more than we could have really have expected, and everyone just came out going, okay, now it's rolling, now it's happening. And I
So
interviewed, sorry,
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I said, and I interviewed Peter. I did all the press conferences, and I did the kind of round tables with the huge amounts of cast that were there, and they put all the hobbits together, and
Yeah.
it was kind of Aragorn and Boromir together doing theirs. So it was a really nice little sort of way they divided up the talent. And I did a one-on-one interview with Jackson, and I think he was quite at the time. He didn't want to be in Cannes, I don't think. I think he's not a great traveler at the best of times. And he was, he was halfway through this film, and I think he understood the need for this event, but
Hmm.
he was at the same time he just like he said, I want to be back there, still creating it.
Hmm.
So he was slightly distant, but he's a lovely guy, and I really enjoyed the fact that he's very, very honest, and he liked. I mean, he comes from a background. I'm sure you know this. He's a real geek, and he
Yeah.
loves film magazines, and he loves gossip, and so he kind of warmed up to that, and he really warmed up to Empire, and I got on very well with him, and that started a relationship that would then blossom down the line
Hmm.
into writing the book.
Yeah.
So obviously, it was a very important day for me, and it was just fantastic. I
Yeah.
shouldn't deny the fact I was in Cannes and I went to this wonderful party in this chateau up on the hills, and they'd had kind of giant bars where you were hobbit sized when you ordered drinks, and cave trolls in the bushes, and they Galadriel's boat on the swimming pool. It was just mad, this
Wow.
whole party. And there was no, it was brilliant. It was really Kiwi in the sense there was no VIP lounge. Everyone
Mm.
just kind of mingled.
Yeah.
And there was kind of stars waltzing this way and that. And it was just a really lovely evening. And that kind of just, I think, just set the tone
Mm.
for both my experience, I think everybody's experience in a way.
Yeah.
Suddenly we were all on side and we were all really into this.
So when did was it at that screening that at what point did you come to the realization, or did you think to yourself, this is something special, this could be huge?
Well, it was definitely that footage. I think, as I said, I already kind of believed in it to a
Hmm.
certain extent. I wasn't one of the naysayers, probably just more out of desperation for it to be brilliant. And I think I'd read the Ancient Core News interview that he'd done for shooting, and that was very encouraging. That he knew, and was very passionate about the material.
Hmm.
We didn't yet know the full scope of the pre-production that had gone on, the various levels of disasters that he had already overcome to get to the place
Yeah.
of actually shooting the film. That wasn't yet quite clear. But it really was, for me, fundamentally, as soon as that footage began playing in that French cinema, it was the same as those memories in my imagination. It was the same as the things I'd remembered. That was
Yeah.
exactly the Mines of Moria that had been in my head. And that was exactly the Hobbiton that had been in my head. And I don't know how he got it and found it. Oh, right, there it is. Gandalf looked like Gandalf. It was as simple as that. It wasn't a kind
Yeah.
of like, oh, I didn't quite picture it like that.
Yeah.
But that was it. Exactly. And Jackson's talked about that. He's a lot of that. He says rather humbly is the fact that he used the Alan Lee and John Howe
Mm.
illustrations, which had been on every copy of the book and been
Right.
everywhere. And I'd got all those calendars. You remember those
Yeah.
yearly calendars we used
And
to
they
have?
still do those. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're fantastic. Yeah.
So it might be that I was heavily influenced by those images,
Hmm.
as Jackson said. But I was just sort of smitten with the fact that absolutely. And I remember really, is it one of the only strange thing, and it was that there's the scene where Gandalf meets Bilbo at the door in his front garden,
Hmm.
and you see the scale for the first time.
Yeah.
That just took a few beats to get your head around,
Yeah.
because while it was perfect on the screen, your brain's going, this isn't right. Look how
Yeah.
small Ian Holm is. He looks completely wrong. And he had to kind of get past that. Go, oh, yeah, of course, Hobbit's a little.
Yeah.
But Ian Holm was the wrong size. It was kind of like, that was a bit bizarre. And it took a little bit of kind of effort to get through. But
Yeah.
of course, once you watch the films, you forget that within minutes.
Yeah.
And for the rest of the trilogy, you just go with the fact that they're small and they're tall and
Yeah.
all of that scale stuff works.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I love watching the behind the scenes features where they show that forced perspective, and like the cart that Frodo and Gandalf are riding in is not the shape of a real cart
Yeah.
because Elijah Wood is way far back from Gandalf, and he's talking to thin air over behind Gandalf to make it look good, look proper on camera. And it's amazing, the ingenuity that they did to achieve that.
Yeah. But what's brilliant is every time I subsequently went on set, and I've been on set of The Hobbits, every time I've been on set and they've done a Gandalf scene, it's Ian McKellen standing on a box. And I think of all the millions of dollars they've spent on these films and all the ingenuity and digital effects at work, every time I've gone on, it's Ian McKellen standing at a box and a camera sort of over his shoulder, looking down on who he's talking to. I think brilliant. The oldest tricks still work.
Yeah, the box will never be replaced. We can't we can't make improvements upon a box, I guess.
Not a box. Can't beat a box.
So you mentioned something earlier, and this is just a thought on the film industry as a whole. You mentioned back then, you guys at Empire were very much on the side of the films. You wanted films to succeed. Do you feel like that has changed a bit in our it seems like I don't know whether it's the films or just our society as a whole. I feel like from a movie watcher perspective, I hear a lot more negative than positive when it comes to films. It almost seems like there's a decent chunk of people that would rather see things fail, I guess. Or they look to pick apart things more.
Yeah.
And I think as a Tolkien fan, I saw that more, when the Hobbit trilogy came out. It just seemed like, it got really nitpicky really quick. And I wondered if that was something that you've seen in your industry.
I don't think it's a new thing, but what I think did change, and this is one of the, hopefully you'll detect it as the book goes on, the smaller themes I tried to pick up on was, as The Lord of the Rings was being made, effectively film coverage on the internet was being invented and amplified.
Yeah.
And that whole idea of following a project almost beat by beat, day by day, was sort of invented by Lord of the Rings more than anything. But it began as a very positive thing. The OneRing.net and all those guys, really, I think was supporting. And Jackson was very brilliant at having the fans on board very quickly. He understood them. He thought like them. He was kind of a fan himself.
Absolutely.
So instead of sort of banishing them, as the startled New Line publicists would have done, and they were all like, lock them out. He said, no, bring them in. Give them a little bit. Keep them fed, and then they'll be on side. And he was exactly right. He nurtured relationships, Ain't It Cool News and the One Ring, and with Empire along the way. And that I think he was brilliant at. But I think the truth of it is that within Hollywood and when the media that covers Hollywood, the negativity goes back decades. I mean, you follow anything that happened to Francis Ford Coppola on Apocalypse Now, and he was declared insane by Hollywood. He'd gone upriver and gone completely out of control. Heaven's Gate. There was all this kind of legacy of the way film is covered. I think what had changed and what is so obvious now is how available it is to us. We don't have to wait for a newspaper or a television show or a radio show. We get it every morning in our inboxes. The stories of what's gone wrong, what's gone right. I mean, I've been fascinated by the kind of spin around Zack Snyder. The fact that Zack Snyder had been declared, the destroyer of DC, the worst thing that ever happened to this. He was criminal number one, for what he was done. And then this kind of revolved to the point where Joss Whedon has been cast out of Eden, and now Zack Snyder is the welcome the hero returning and embraced. The Snyder Cut, give him 4 hours, and he's a great man and produces great work. It's just mad. And so it is a crazy world, but I think you're right in the sense. I think what happened subsequently of Lord of the Rings and into many other films was there was this kind of intense focus on what was going on, and an industry was invented around it. Websites that run on this stuff was invented. And of course, they need to be fed and they need to keep supplying news or they'll die. So I think what, the interesting change that happened with The Hobbit was that, these websites were now existing and very big businesses, as opposed to the kind of the rather kind of humble fan-led things, the beginnings during Lord of the Rings. And so it was much more wary and watchful of what The Hobbit was doing. And, and of course there was that whole period when, once you built Jackson up and give him all these Oscars and sort of deify him for doing the impossible, it's time to bring him down again.
Right.
And The Hobbit and all the kind of the troubles that went with The Hobbit were kind of almost doubly amplified because of that.
Absolutely. Now you mentioned Zack Snyder. I actually did have on my list to bring that up because I think it's a very interesting arc. Like you said, he was kind of banished from DC, like, DC's destroyed. Now he's back as the savior of DC. And for the record, so today, as we're filming this, is the release day of the Snyder Cut. So it's kind of appropriate for us to touch on this. So do you think this this kind of concept, obviously we had the Joss Whedon version of Justice League, and just from a kind of grew, fueled by Zack, but then also fueled by this grassroots, fan drive to get this cut released. Do you think there's any chance that, studios look at this and say, maybe in some instances we've gotten too involved on the creative side and pushed our will on the directors, and take a step back? I think another example, a director that you've covered, Ridley Scott. I absolutely love the director's cut of Kingdom of Heaven.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the greatest examples of this, where, the studio just kind of deemed it needed to be hacked and, subplots taken out. And so there's a night and day difference between the director's cut, in my mind, of Kingdom of Heaven with the theatrical. Do you think this, the Snyder Cut phenomenon is just a one-off, or do you think, there's a chance for this to have a reverberating effect in the industry?
I don't think it's one of. I mean, if it's a success and the amount of publicity it's got, I'm sure we'll make it a success. Even though people in 4 hours is a lot of time to give up to it. I think there will be a change. I think you have to bear in mind with situations like Kingdom of Heaven and even the original theatrical cuts of Lord of the Rings, which are obviously so different from the extended cuts. There's always a precedent and a necessity about the time you have to edit, the amount of commercial space that can be given by a cinema to a length of film, and what are the consequences upon box office totals. That's got to be borne in mind. And so I think studios will always operate around those lines. But what's changing is a sort of paradigm shift in culture, in terms of we're much more ready to watch things on a small screen now, and much more willing to. Partly because of the pandemic, and partly because cinema has sort of been ebbing a little bit over the last probably 5 or 6 years.
I think the pandemic kind of just sped it up. Like it was kind of already heading that direction, and the pandemic just kicked it into gear.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The pandemic is this kind of catalyst for the Netflix sort of attitude. And there's just been this strange thing, hasn't there, about sort of strong narrative storytelling has sort of shifted out of cinemas and into box sets, as they call them. It's this terminology, but extended television series that are done like movie arcs, in the sense they are one story rather than endlessly repeating the same story. And that's changed attitudes, I think, towards the long cut and the long version. So I think we will see not only more directorial driven cuts of feature films. It's likely we will see sort of cinema versions, then 3 hour, 4 hour versions, because people seem to like this long thing. Will we see this? Apparently it's a 4 hour cut of 1492, Ridley Scott's Columbus film, which I really liked, his Columbus film. And it was kind of derided at the time, but that might appear on HBO at some point. I mean, what's to lose? You can run it as a mini series.
Right.
I think that the worry for me would be that there is an art in the film format that's different to television, and different. That the 2 hour film is kind of an art, and we don't want to lose that. Or even the 90-minute film that's kind of required. So yes, I think there's a huge shift going on. I'd be interested to see what happens with the Zack Snyder Justice League. What that happened. It's interesting that you look at what Marvel are doing, and if you take Marvel to one gigantic story with
Mm-hmm.
many different sort of facets, they're now doing
Yeah.
bits as television series that fold straight back into films, that fold
Yeah.
back out into TV series. I mean, it's dizzying to sort of
Yeah.
get hold of. But they're saying, well, it doesn't matter. We can do this. We can
Yeah.
dance between formats, and audiences will just go with this. So,
Yeah.
it's changing world.
Yeah. Going back to Peter Jackson and kind of the beginnings of the Lord of the Rings, in retrospect, as we look at more current blockbusters like the Marvel series, it's kind of makes it even more astonishing that Peter Jackson, while I think he had an Oscar nomination at that point, he was still as far as worldwide audience, he wasn't a household name by any means at that point. Fairly unknown director, and the idea that he was given a property as big as the Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure there was some studio input here and there, but by and large, he was kind of given creative reins. And you look at something like Marvel, they kind of bring people in, but they're working underneath Kevin Feige, and the studio kind of has their, obviously they've had some directors leave for creative differences and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it seems like they've kind of have their finger on everything. Whereas, it seems like from an outside perspective, Peter Jackson was kind of given the reins of Lord of the Rings. And it's kind of just another example of how this all came together so miraculously almost.
Yes, it's true. I think there are a number of factors in that. One is that New Line and Bob Shea, who was really the kind of creative head of New Line, Michael Lyne was sort of the financial bit of it. Then they were the two heads of the firm. Bob Shea was more distant than like a Harvey Weinstein or even a Kevin Feige. He ran the whole company, and he sort of kept off things. I think they monitored the bottom line. They monitored casting very closely. And there was a lot of discussion around the final cuts and the length of things. There was quite a lot of arguing around those. And there were occasional fracas that broke out. I think around special effects early on, there was a great deal of worry from New Line's side that Weta weren't up to it. And there was a bit of, they kind of brought in Joe Letteri, and they brought in a lot of people who sort of from ILM to kind of bring a bit of experience to Weta to kind of get it on an even playing field. But beyond those, Jackson was relatively less alone. I think they didn't really understand the book particularly. I don't know whether they read it or not, but it confused them. So I think a little bit was like, okay, let them go and do the thing. And the other big thing was they were in New Zealand, the other end of the world. Half of Hollywood couldn't find New Zealand on a map. So they were miles away, and everything was in New Zealand. It wasn't just they were going to do the exteriors in New Zealand. They were going to shoot. They had a studio in New Zealand. They had the special effects people. They had the practical effects people. It was all there, set up in New Zealand, and like a little autonomous kingdom that Jackson had built around Lord of the Rings. So they were kind of self-sufficient in a way, and they didn't need to go back to LA and to close to New Line. They were a geographical thing.
And that's a long flight.
Yeah.
If you wanted to go check on the production, you got to get on a 20-hour plane flight or something.
I think, and I may be wrong, but I think Bob Shea and Michael Lyne only visited twice in the entire year and a half initial production, and then 3 years of post-production. So they did keep their distance. The other great advantage was Mark Ordesky, who was put on as executive producer, and really he was the go-between between New Line and Peter Jackson. Mark Ordesky was both a great friend of Peter Jackson's and a huge fan of Peter Jackson's, and also a huge fan of the book, an absolute acolyte of Tolkien's world. So he was, honestly the heartbeat of, I think, getting this kind of translation between what was going on in New Zealand and what was going on in LA. And he was relaying the news to Bob Shea. And then what he was doing was keeping Bob Shea away from the production. He was going, it's great. You know, they were looking at footage. You know, they were
Yeah.
seeing the stuff, and they could see that it was good quality.
Hmm.
Jackson talks very much about the moment when he kind of had them. Michael Lyon and Bob Shaye, they'd come over for a visit and they toured the sets and they toured Weta and done the thing, and they'd spoken to the cast, and they finally got shown some footage, and there was no special effects yet done. It was far too early for that. But he showed them as part of this sort of montage of stuff that Michael Lyon saw, Bob Shaye and Michael Lyon saw, was the death of Boromir.
Mm.
And he said, Jackson said, as they came out, he saw tears in their
Mm.
eyes. He thought, I've got them, you know.
Yeah.
And he said, and that's when Michael Lyon, I think he said, turned to him and said, it's a drama. Jackson's like, well, what do you expect? Of course, it's a drama. But I think they were thinking Conan the Barbarian. They were thinking
Yeah.
it's a kind of Star Warsy, you know, kind of mentality, or that the film would have. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But Jackson was making David Lean. You know, he was making something serious and epic.
Yeah.
He was treating it like it was, you know, a big thing and a big drama. And I think that woke them up a little bit. They were like, "There's acting going on in these films. There's performances. Oh my god, we should everybody stop. You know, call the publicists." And that kind of, I think that started the ball rolling to the Cannes footage being shown, because they realized there was something to boast about to the world.
Yeah, and you know, the fact that, you know, that it's, I think to date it's still the only fantasy film to win Best Picture, Return of the King. And like you said, you know, they kind of thought they had a Conan the Barbarian kind of thing. And then, and, you know, you see after, you know, obviously after the films are released, you're now thinking, oh, hey, Oscars now.
Yeah, there was a huge, the shift happened in terms of Oscars. And obviously, if you work in the studio in Hollywood, and it's a very incestuous sort of world, the Oscars are enormous. You know, they are the credit system of Hollywood.
Yeah.
You know, you can make loads of money, and that's brilliant, and that's what you're there for. But to win Oscars elevates you. And of course, New Line had never had Oscars. They had Fine Line had bits and pieces, I think, with Paul Thomas Anderson stuff, and there'd been a few sort of screenplay awards.
Yeah.
But not on that level. And it began with Fellowship and the nominations that Fellowship got. And Michael Desi's very good on that, because they hadn't really campaigned for Fellowship very hard, because they didn't have faith that the Academy would care.
Yeah.
I mean, the film had been superbly well reviewed and become a huge hit. So they were in a good place. But Desi said they had no concept that the Academy were going to pay attention. And he said they kind of thought we'll get some, you know, special effects things, some cinematography things, maybe, you know, that side of it, the technical awards. But
that's what they give the fantasy movies. It's the technical stuff. Well
done, you guys. You know, you've created, you know, this wonderful world, and it's all brilliant. But you know, it's not serious films, is it?
Yeah.
And as Essie said, it was kind of, it's, you know, getting Ian McKellen, you know, for supporting actor, that nomination said was real kind of, you know, cracking the glass ceiling. And then the kind of Best Picture nomination for Fellowship, that changed everything. He said, you know, obviously they were fully behind what was going on by that point. But he said once all that happened with Fellowship, the money started getting freed up to finish Two Towers and Return of the King properly. Yeah. That really let Jackson loose. You know, they went, right, we're getting a huge hit and we're getting Oscar attention. So it really refocused. And obviously by Return of the King, the entire company was focused on getting those awards, and then
absolutely,
you know, the final hurdle passed.
Yeah. And so after Fellowship comes out, they get, like you said, they get more money to do Two Towers, Return of the King. From your perspective and your time talking with Peter Jackson, how did that affect you know, the production as a whole? Or, you know, obviously their approach probably didn't change much, aside from now they, you know, they could probably do some things that they might not have been able to do before.
Yeah, I think obviously having more money and built up a more kind of facility in New Zealand, and greater processing power, if nothing else, at Weta Digital.
Yeah.
You know, they went from just sort of a few mainframes that tended to get crashed if they got too hot, you know, to the point, I think I visited on Return of the King and on Two Towers, They did these kind of large supplementary shoots. I visited both. And by the time of Return of the King, they had the largest processing power in the Southern Hemisphere, was in Weta, in this suburb of Wellington in New Zealand, this kind of tiny little place. So that was kind of a huge upward trajectory. And at the beginning, they always had ambition, but they never, Jackson's face with they would find a way. And they would work out how to do things. And they were figuring out how to do the battles using this software called Massive, involving lots of independently sort of brained little soldiers and had their own minds. And there's great stuff on the DVDs all about that.
Absolutely.
But obviously, I think beyond obviously the narrative expansions and the chance to go back and reshoot things with these huge extra shooting, it was Gollum, I think, that was the thing that the money went into. Because at the time of right up to the release of Fellowship of the Ring, I think New Line were convinced it was going to have to go to ILM to do, because Weta weren't capable. And Jackson just wouldn't listen to that. He said, no, we're going to do Gollum. We have to do Gollum. But he didn't know how they were going to do Gollum. They sort of had a vague idea at the beginning that it was going to be a sort of keyframe animation with Andy Serkis hired to do the voice. And then obviously it's a very famous story, but Andy Serkis came in to do the audition in London and had read up on the book and developed the voice, based on his cat and all sorts of different things. And when he did the audition for this voice bite, he started clambering over the furniture and sort of ripping his shirt off, and it was just incredible. And he kind of left in a flurry. And Fran Walsh, who was in the audition, sort of turned to Peter Jackson and goes, "We've got to get him on the set. We need that energy on the set." And that was the kind of the stone that began the kind of rockfall that created Gollum. Because they started thinking about motion capture as a serious way of doing it. But honestly, they did not know how it was going to work. So it was like a science experiment that just grew and grew and grew. And I think that's the key place where the faith that Fellowship of the Ring had created in the project was focused in terms of, certainly Two Towers, was making Gollum work. Because you think about it, it's like, even after the Fellowship of the Ring, if Gollum doesn't work, he's a mess. The whole thing kind of collapses, because he's a pivotal character. In some ways, he's the most important character in the whole story. He's the most interesting character in the whole story because he's ambiguous. He's sort of he's one of Tolkien's most inspired creations. You can't avoid him. But if it didn't work, we'd be laughing at it. It'd be Jar Jar Binks all over again.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
So they were taking a huge risk. And I think that was the great example of New Line's faith and investment, and then the sheer extraordinary thinking that was going on in New Zealand, from Jackson, from Fran Walsh, from Andy Serkis, from all the brilliant people at Weta who figured out how to do this. And that story alone is the evolution of that character and the technology. And by the reshoots or the supplementary shoots on Return of the King, they could shoot Andy actually out in the wilds and then capture him, on location. That's and if you think about the effect of that on the industry, no Gollum, no Avatar, all those things. Half of the things that go on in the Marvel films, all was invented by that audition in London. Andy Serkis went a bit crazy on them. And they went, "We've got to have him on set." It's small things and huge effect.
And even just the films that Andy has since gone on to do, I think of, the Planet of the Apes series has some of the most amazing, performances by CG characters, obviously spearheaded by Andy himself. One of my favorite stories, I think it's on the appendices on the DVDs. It's just one of those things that the timing, things just clicked. I remember them talking about attempting to make the Balrog, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to do the flames. And so they're filming flames on a black backdrop and trying to, try to compose that with the footage. And then while they're in production of Fellowship of the Ring, someone creates CG fire for the first time. And I think it was somewhere else, somewhere not in Weta necessarily, but someone had created it. So now they had access to CG fire, and it just kind of clicked into place, at the right time.
I think the timing of Lord of the Rings is, at so many levels is so fortuitous. So not only is it the emergence of this incredible talent in New Zealand, it's the point where certain things, and Jackson kind of foresaw this, that the special effects are caught up with Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
They hadn't quite, as you're saying, they were almost there. And he
Yeah.
had to have faith that they would keep going. I mean, they didn't really quite know how to do water.
Mm.
You know, the river, the scene with Liv Tyler and the kind of the
Yeah.
ride getting washed away. That had to be done in the States, obviously by digital domain, because
Ah,
they had
yes.
figured out how to do water effects.
Yeah.
And obviously fire had been sort of discovered. And all these leaps and bounds were going on during production. All films find a way of achieving their stories, and
Yeah.
all films are kind of battles to kind of figure out and make the story work on screen.
Mm-hmm.
But there is incredible kind of fortune that Jackson was blessed with, or earned in many ways. He earned this fortune, and that these things would come around. I mean,
Yeah.
the story of massive software is the legacy of that. It's just so huge
Yeah.
in terms of where it came from, and AI software and experiments, completely outside of film. And
Mm-hmm.
then the fact that it was adopted, and they realized suddenly what they could do.
Yeah.
And of course, now they use massive to grow whole planets in
Right.
films. Yeah, it's an astonishing piece of software.
Yeah.
And
And one of the amazing thing, I always think when I rewatch Lord of the Rings is how well all those effects hold up after 20 years. It's been 20 years since Fellowship came out, and I was just watching The Two Towers the other day, and I'm sitting there, watching Gollum, and obviously there's some differences between him in terms of how he looks in The Hobbit. He looks a little more polished, I guess you could say, in The Hobbit, but I mean, by and large, for a 20-year-old movie, it holds up extremely well in terms of the effects.
it does. It does. I know Jackson can't really look at them. He's only revisited the films once. This is
Mm-hmm.
amazing. When Guillermo del Toro was on The Hobbit, and they watched them together. They put them on a big cinema screen, but he's never watched them again. He can't face it. He'll look at things and go,
Yeah,
no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. He'll see things that we can't see, micro
absolutely.
things. I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that they use New Zealand so well,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't, a landscape can't age,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the context of the film.
Yeah.
That will always look fresh and brilliant. And to a certain extent, they didn't overplay the special effects hand.
Yeah.
They used it they marshaled it very, very cleverly.
Mm-hmm.
And they used the idea of kind of Gollum, you shoot him at night
Mm-hmm.
much more than you shoot him at day, certainly during
Right.
The Two Towers, which is a skillful use of the fact that it's very hard to do those kind of special effects in daylight.
Mm-hmm.
It's much easier to do them at night.
Right.
It sort of stays good. And of course, it's about storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And if storytelling is so strong and so
Yeah.
well done, we don't stop to go, oh, does that character fit in the landscape properly? Is
Right.
it being rendered as well as it could be these days?
Yeah.
But I'm with you. I look at all those, the Uruk-hai arriving at Helm's Deep,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't see a fault in that. It's just an
Right.
astonishing sequence.
Yeah.
The kind of army moving up, the way it's edited and put together, and you just don't even think it's a special effect. You're not even, your brain's not doing that. It's going, wow. Yeah. So it does live 20 years. It's amazing.
Yeah. And when I think back to here a few months ago when I was reviewing the 4K editions that came out, and I sit down to watch the films, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to pay really close attention to the details, and so I can review this. And it would, without fail, I'd get about 20 minutes in, and I'd just be sucked in, and then an hour later, it's like, yeah, I was supposed to be watching over this with a fine-tooth comb. But like, you're totally dead on. The storytelling is so good and so captivating that your mind doesn't wander to look for cracks in the effects or anything like that.
No, I think that they realized that almost within the shoot. I mean, the scale thing we were talking about at the beginning, and they'd worked so hard to try and get that to work and figure that out. And Jackson said most of the time, once they were well into the shoot, it didn't matter so much.
Mm-hmm.
You could shoot someone on a box and put the camera over their shoulder, or put the hobbits further up an incline, and the great scene between Frodo and Boromir when he tries to get the ring from him. There's no scale effects in that sequence. It's just Elijah Wood's further up the hill.
Perspective. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's the thing is that in our heads they're already small, so
right.
we stop sort of looking for it, because
Yeah.
we're already thinking they're small.
Yeah.
So he gets away with things after all. So you didn't need to spend all this money with digital effects, and it was much harder on the Hobbit when you've got all the dwarves
Hmm.
constantly, and you have scenes with Gandalf. That's trickier, and it was
Yeah.
much harder to get around. So they had to kind of use a lot more digital apparatus
Hmm.
to do that. But in terms of rings, they just realized that and have confidence in the fact that we're with it. We're with the
Hmm.
film. Obviously, they had bigger sets and smaller sets and all those things that helped them out, especially with Hobbiton. But you go with it.
Yeah.
You don't question it.
Yeah. I love, so to go a little bit forward. So we've kind of talked about through, after Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers. One of the things that I love about Lord of the Rings and why it's such a great trilogy is, I had read, by the time Return of the King was getting ready to come out, I had caught up. I was introduced by the films. I had caught up and read everything up to Return of the King, and so that was the film I went into with the most expectations. And I felt like, going in like, oh, I hope they stick the landing, and, everything's boiled down to this last film. And, we oftentimes, the debate among movie buffs is, name sequels, the second film that's better than the first film, and everyone throws out, Empire Strikes Back, Godfather Part 2. But I think it's even more rare when you have a third film and all three are such great caliber and so close in excellence. So I felt like they absolutely nailed the landing on that one.
Yeah, I think they had advantages in a sense. They had the books, they already
Hmm.
existed, and
Right.
it was
Yeah.
there for them in the sense that Godfather Part 2 and Empire had to invent
Right.
those
Yeah.
stories off the back of the originals, and as
That's
did
true.
like Terminator 2 and Aliens, the other great examples. There was that ingenious and inspired idea of shooting them as much as they could all together.
Hmm.
So you shoot it as one film,
Yeah.
so that the tone and feel and experience for all the actors and crew. Sorry, I'm moving out of camera there. Was as one.
Hmm.
So there was a kind of real kind of uniformity to what they were doing. But what I like is the different feel between the three films.
Hmm.
Obviously, they are one story,
Right.
and it's that feeling like when you watch, you get to the end of Return of the King, you no longer see three films, you only feel one
Hmm.
big story. It kind of joins it all together.
Yeah.
But I like the fact they had different styles to them.
Hmm.
The first one is slightly more of a fairy tale, a slightly
Hmm.
more enchanted feel. It's to do with the fact that it's a bit more elvish in
Yeah.
terms of the journey they go on, and it's much
Yeah.
more antiquity. The second one is the western, yeah,
Hmm.
and the battle movie, and it has the kind of the kind of robust landscapes, and it's
Hmm.
much more rugged. It's much
Yeah.
more rocks, and it widens, if anything. And the third one is just it's all exposition. Jackson said, he said, I've done all two films of pure setup, and now all I've got to do is 3 hours of complete exposition and
Yeah.
complete kind of delivery.
Yeah. Stuff
And
just happens left and right.
it's bang, 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 completion. You don't have to worry about building up characters and those
Right.
things. We know who these people are
Yeah.
by now, and you just do it. And he was so confident in terms of the edit, I think, by the third film, that he knew what his story was. I always think about the great choices in Return of the King. That shows you a director in command of the
Hmm.
material. Was opening with Andy Serkis,
Mm.
opening small, in
Yeah.
this tiny intimate scene about where the ring had come from. And that had been a really incidental sequence they were going to put into Two Towers at some point,
Right.
but never found room for it. And it kind of dangled until Jackson said for Fran Walsh, let's put it at the front
Hmm.
of Return of the King. And if you look at the three openings of the three films, they're all memories.
Right.
They're all flashbacks.
Yeah.
One is the great history, the prologue,
Prologue. Yeah.
flashback to where the ring came from. The second one is Frodo remembering the death of Gandalf and flashing
Mm.
back to
Yeah.
the first film. And then the third film is the flashback to Gollum's story and
Hmm.
how he changed. We saw Andy Serkis's face,
Yeah.
finally, not digital. And the other great, fantastic sequence for me where I just thought, Jackson, you are hands-on, completely in control of your material, was the lighting of the beacons. I think you have that kind
Ah.
of build up, and
Yeah.
then you have this kind of it's just the camera is bounding across the world,
Hmm. Yeah.
In a one montage, he travels, I don't know what, 500 miles or more
Right.
across
Yeah.
this world, because that's what he can do now. This is
Yeah.
such his playground. This camera can go bounce from mountain to mountain and goes from one character, Pippin, right the way to Aragorn.
Right.
And I thought, bravo,
Yeah.
you are now you're completely in command. And from then on, it's just glorious, isn't it? It's just spectacle after spectacle. And he's
Yeah.
showing off. By the time the elephants are charging, you're just
Oh
showing
my
off now. And,
gosh. Yeah. Yeah. With the way the camera, tracks behind the Rohirrim, and you're gradually getting closer and closer to the Oliphants. Yeah. It's that. And, like you said, with the beacons, it's like, this is Jackson's show and we're just along for the ride. And yeah, I just remember, moment after moment, in Return of the King, especially just thinking, oh my God, this is amazing.
he never loses the intimacy. I think the great quality of the
Yeah.
films is that the small moments always
Mm-hmm.
count. It's something Philippa Boyens always talked about, is that you have to earn your action beats. You have to
Mm-hmm.
earn your big moments, your big scenes. And if you don't earn them, they're cheap,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of action movies never understand.
Right. Yeah.
We have to know what's at stake every time you go into a battle, every time you
Mm-hmm.
reach a crescendo. So we have to go through those scenes with Sam and Frodo. We have to go through
Yeah.
the kind of claustrophobia of certain sequence. We have to have the parting of Merry and Pippin, and the
Yeah.
wrenching of that
Yeah.
to earn, all the stuff that was to come.
Comes after. Yeah.
We have to go on Eowyn's journey with
Mm-hmm.
her to earn the moment when she kills the Witch King. You
Right.
have to, and all I think that's great screenwriting.
Mm-hmm.
They're figuring out that you can't just land on these signature moments
Mm-hmm.
without the audience having been prepared for them to know
Yeah.
what the characters are going through. And that's what proper films do. You
Yeah.
earn this stuff rather than just deliver it.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I love about the Lord of the Rings films is, there's moments in there, obviously, that are not obviously from Tolkien. One of my absolute favorite moments of the film is not in the books, and that's when Gandalf and Pippin are talking about death in Minas Tirith. And like you said, it's those small character moments, we're in the midst of this huge epic battle, and then you have this moment that is just, in my mind, is just pure gold.
Yeah. Well, it's an understanding, and I think a lot of that comes from Frau and Philippa Boyens, and Jackson would say so. The thematic understanding of material that
Mm-hmm.
the book, in a way, and the whole world of Middle Earth was a response to Tolkien's experiences in the First World War and the death of friends, and
Mm-hmm.
having gone through that extraordinary experience and been transformed by it.
Mm-hmm.
I think he imbued all his writing in Middle Earth with a sense of that. And as many great Tolkien sort of scholars have said, the great theme of the book is death.
Yeah.
That's fundamentally what it's about. The Undying Lands is the afterlife. It's about cost and death and sacrifice. And they never lose sight of that. As filmmakers, they understood that. I mean, Jackson is a great scholar of World War I, and I think he really took that on board. And Boyens, of course, who's has a huge knowledge of Tolkien.
Right.
She was the one who'd read the biographies and read the academic works and sort of kept saying to them, we've got to have this stuff. We've got to understand this stuff, that the relationship between Frodo and Sam is a relationship between a captain and his servant in World War One. It's about cross-class relationships. So, it's a subtext, but it's there. And as you're saying, that great moment with Gandalf and Pippin is about confronting death and being able to do that. And that, I think, goes back to Tolkien.
Yeah. So we've got Return of the King. So Return of the Kings come out, and then we have this big gap before we start on The Hobbit. And you go into this in the book, so we don't have to get into the weeds on it. But basically, the rights to The Hobbit were an absolute mess. One company owned the distribution rights, another the production rights, which, and it's a miracle, honestly, that they even got it figured out. I remember, being on pins and needles for years, which is a long time to be on pins and needles, waiting, news trickling out. It's like, okay, yes, we're going to make it. Okay. Guillermo del Toro is going to direct it. No, he's not. Now Peter Jackson's going to direct it. So The Hobbit was, a whole different beast in and of itself. Obviously, coming after Lord of the Rings, the massive success there, the expectations are sky high, and there's all kinds of background rights issues going on leading up to that.
It was one of the hardest things to try and figure out in doing all of my book, was quite why the Hobbit rights were so tangled up. And I without actually seeing original documents, I kind of figured out as far as I could that it all went back to United Artists getting the rights from Tolkien and being unable to figure out a way of making Lord of the Rings, and United Artists then being in a very difficult position, being bought out by MGM, and everything that was kind of tangled up with United Artists went to MGM. And there was a point when Bakshi was trying to do Lord of the Rings with United Artists, and they gave up on him.
Yeah.
And literally, they were all in the same building as MGM. They were literally physically down the corridor. And he was sent down the corridor to MGM, who then in that moment, I think, got the rights to distribute both a version of The Hobbit and version of Lord of the Rings. It's so complicated.
Yeah.
And in the end, Lord of the Rings kind of went back to, eventually was bought out by Saul Zaentz.
Right.
But he didn't buy the Hobbit bit of distribution. That kind of got left behind in this sort of mix of United Artists and MGM. Everything else went with Zaentz. It was kind of, it feels to me like there was a lawyer who hadn't quite checked all the paragraphs properly somewhere way back. So when it came to it, as you say, there was this Warner, and New Line obviously had been absorbed into Warner. They had the right to make a version of The Hobbit, but could not legally distribute it because MGM retained the right to distribute The Hobbit. Even though MGM had nothing to do with Lord of the Rings and very little to do with anything else. They just had this thing. And of course, MGM were in really bad financial trouble at that time. So weren't willing to sell this thing. It was one of the things that was keeping them solvent, was the fact they could distribute The Hobbit.
Yeah.
And this dragged the whole thing into a mire. There were some weird places it all went to. There was the whole period when Jackson and his management grew concerned they hadn't been paid all the money that was due to them by New Line, which was a hindrance, and that broke down relationships between Jackson and Bob Shaye. So at which point I think Jackson almost let it go and said, okay, I'm going to go off and do my own films, King Kong. And there was talk at that point where I think Bob Shaye tried with New Line to get a version going with Sam Raimi directing The Hobbit.
Oh, yeah.
That
kind of forgot about that.
That hovered around for a little bit. Then there were some very wise people, Ken Kamens being one of them, Jackson's manager, the then head of MGM, who wasn't willing to let the Sam Raimi version happen because he wanted Peter Jackson to do it. And he called up Jackson's management and said, what's the mess? And said they found out about this breakdown, and a phone call was had between Bob Shaye and Peter Jackson, and things were healed. And then, and gradually, and this took so long, but it was, in the end, it was just about money. And it was money in terms of MGM being able to financially distribute the film on some level. They had the right to, but did they have the infrastructure?
Yeah, because they were going through bankruptcy around that time.
Yeah. And it was whether MGM were even going to exist. And I imagine kind of some of those people at Warner Brothers, who are obviously very successful company, were kind of hovering around thinking, well, if MGM does go under, can we buy the rights to distribute it back from the courts? Can we steal that out of it? But they weren't quite that kind of ailing MGM. So that's why it just took so long. And they got to a point where MGM were keen. They just needed to sort out some last bits of their problems. And Warner Brothers put pre-production together. And that's where the whole Guillermo del Toro era began. And Jackson was only going to produce. And various scripts were written at that stage. And a lot of money was spent. I think upwards of $60 million was spent developing The Hobbit for Guillermo del Toro, and with Jackson producing, by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers spent all that money. And one of the reasons why Jackson, in the end, I think rather reluctantly went into The Hobbit was that Warner Brothers was saying, we're going to shut the whole thing down. We can't lose any more money on this. This is becoming a turkey. You've got to direct it. It was an offer he couldn't refuse, to put it in Godfather parlance, And he had all the people in New Zealand, under Weta Digital, or Weta Workshop, all the crew that he was going to put together to shoot these films, thousands of people now who needed a job.
Yeah.
And I think Jackson had a responsibility towards that. But I don't think particularly, I think he was very devoted to the films. It was quite the same as Lord of the Rings for him.
Right.
It wasn't quite the
Yeah.
same thing in his heart.
Yeah.
He'd done Middle-earth. He'd won Oscars for Middle-earth. Did he need to go back? And
Yeah.
the reasons he went back, and I think just cast a little bit of a shadow on what he was doing.
Yeah. And, obviously it's been pretty well documented, the difference in the production timeline alone. You think of the massive amount of pre-production done for Lord of the Rings. I mean, they were in the very beginning of this process 10 years before Fellowship even was released. And then, you get into The Hobbit, and I can't remember exactly the time frame. I want to say it's like a year and a half or something.
It's a bit of both. There had been 3 years of Guillermo del Toro development,
right,
where a lot of design work was done for Guillermo del Toro in his particular style. While it was going to be the same world, it was going to have a Guillermo del Toro feel, clockwork, vast kind of machines, the Dwarven kingdoms, that kind of stuff that he was a bit steampunky. I think he was going to bring to it. He developed an idea of changing the skies, that he would replace the skies with these kind of mad digital skies that would give it a very different kind of look. Although he did promise it was the same world. He was just going to do it through his lens, which is fair enough. He was director.
Yeah.
And of course, Jackson didn't feel confident just to pick that stuff up. That wasn't his signature.
Right.
So all that kind of had to be jettisoned.
Yeah.
There were bits and pieces I think they kept, but most of it was jettisoned. And he had to go back and look amongst the designs. And what's incredible, Richard Taylor spoke to me about this, was that I think once you're successful and you have the backing of a studio, you're not trying to prove yourself as they were with Lord of the Rings, is you almost have too much freedom. And he said with Lord of the Rings, every costume or every weapon had probably 3 or 4 different versions. So with The Hobbit, they had 20 versions. There was this kind of overabundance of options. That was almost inhibiting. It was chaos in the sense of they were doing too much. They were creating too much because they were able to. And it created a kind of neurosis, I think, in it, that they became less sure of what they were doing instead of more sure. It had almost a backward effect on them. And of course, as you say, once Jackson had accepted he had to direct, he only had a matter of months to hone in on the look of key things. He almost had to make up a lot of the stuff as he went along. So there was always a sense of running to catch up with the production, to kind of keep it going, find the look of things. And it was different in a way from the joys of discovery that with Lord of the Rings, where they found Gollum, they found a way to do it, and they found a way to do the battles.
Yeah.
With The Hobbit, it was a kind of sense of just keeping the whole thing coherent.
Afloat. Yeah.
Yeah. And with a tone of voice that they liked. I mean, Jackson said very much that he struggled with the tone of the book because the book is very different from Lord of the Rings.
So different.
Yeah. It has a sort of a rather jolly sort of fairy tale-y, tale, told to children at bedtime.
Yeah.
Which is what it was. It was what Tolkien told to his children.
You have the narrator kind of cracking jokes at Bilbo's expense a little bit here and there. Yeah. It's very... it's very
kind of ironic. Yeah, it's a little bit self-aware. It's kind of quite postmodern in its own bizarre way. And Jackson, I think, had a great deal of trouble embracing that, because on one hand, actually, that is his kind of style. If you look at Brain Dead and The Frighteners and his early films, that kind of slightly self-mocking quality is very Jackson, and I think he liked that. But he also had this kind of great edifice of Lord of the Rings sort of to live up to and to be part of. So how do you kind of marry, jokes about dwarves being a kind of bunch of punk rockers, basically stumbling about Middle Earth, with the grandiose sort of ornate sort of nature of Lord of the Rings? And I think it kind of struggles to maintain those two tones, bring them together.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I'd wished actually that he'd gone more crazy. Yeah, he'd gone more madcap and just gone, I'm just going to push this into the tone of voice of the book. I'm going to go mad with it.
Yeah.
And I think he had a lot of pressure from the studio, though, to make it more like Lord of the Rings.
Make another Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
To be like that. And these are the battles then he was suddenly fighting.
Yeah. And, obviously, and we'll get to, the decision to turn it from 2 films into 3. But yeah, there seems to be, from what I've read, a lot more studio influence, kind of bearing down on him for The Hobbit than there was for Lord of the Rings. You mentioned in Lord of the Rings, they kind of didn't take the flight, and I've heard, from talking with some people involved, at times you've got representatives from 3 studios. You've got, of course, by then, New Line had kind of been absorbed, I guess, by Warner Brothers. So you've got New Line, you've got Warner Brothers, and you've got MGM all throwing their hats in the ring for input into these films.
Yes, I think it was so hard to kind of juggle. It was a very different point in time for Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he had become very important.
Mm-hmm.
The whole setup in New Zealand had become a big deal in terms of Hollywood. They something, as you say, they knew where New Zealand was after all. They could take the flight. Private jets were landing in Wellington Airport quite frequently. So it was a different place to make a film from. It was a different time. And he was dealing with not the kind of passionate, rather bizarre, rather sort of eccentric voices of New Line as it was, who were an independent in many ways.
Yeah,
he was now dealing with the kind of great machinery of particularly Warner Brothers and also bits of MGM and HBO. I think there's all sorts of various people who were involved.
Yeah,
and I remember I was on set of Hobbit quite early. I think they were only a month into shooting. And they were doing Arrival at Rivendell stuff with the dwarves arrive at Rivendell. And it was rather sadly all indoors. I was rather disappointed by the fact they weren't out on location. But obviously, the Stone Street Studios was now a much different place, a much more sophisticated place. But on that day, and I was chatting with Jackson, he pointed over, and there was a group of people sort of sat by a monitor, all wearing the 3D glasses, all with rather serious faces. And he goes, "That's Warner hierarchy." He goes, "Do you want to go and talk to them?" I can't talk to them. I'm just a visiting journalist. So I don't want to talk to them. They were there already. There was never that sense on Lord of the Rings that there was kind of some kind of illicit. It was a bunch of Kiwis doing their magic in Lord of the Rings, but there was the presence of the studio. They weren't interfering with him. They weren't kind of sitting over his shoulder at all. There was none of that.
Right.
But they were there.
Yeah.
And they all looked so bored. It was just like, why are you bored? It's Ian McKellen and there's all these dwarves, and it was great. And they were even riding horses around the studio. It was fantastic. But these Warner people just looked bored as they stared at the monitor. It was different. It was a different atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know how you could be bored on the set of Lord of the Rings in New Zealand. I cannot think of a less boring place that I would want to be.
No, I honestly, I've been a very privileged guy in what I've done and throughout my career. But going to the supplementary shoots of Lord of the Rings particularly was just fabulous. It was not just because of what you saw, and what you saw was extraordinary and hilarious. You'd go to have the kind of the canteen where they all ate at lunchtime, and there'll be people made up as orcs because obviously there wasn't time to take the makeup off, and all they could do was drink things out of cartons because they couldn't get the food in. So all these orcs kind of like was cartons like this, and in would come Ian McKellen and Christopher Lee, and their beards had to be in nets because it might drape in the food. And they would queue up for like everyone else with the catering. It was just fantastic, that atmosphere. And of course, you were seeing these sets and visiting locations and all of that. It was just an extraordinary feel. And I'd been on movie sets in Hollywood and in England and big productions. And there's always an element of paranoia with journalists around, as if there's something is going to be revealed that shouldn't be revealed. We have to stay and stand where we are and behave ourselves. You're treated rather like a school trip. Whereas in New Zealand, they were just thrilled to have me there. They were just so excited. They wanted to show me things. Come, have you been to the workshop yet? Come and see this. You're always like, hold on. And it was like, I was like a child. You'd go to the workshop where all these armor and weapons, and you'd pick up, swords and have your photo taken with swords. It was a magical thing. And it was great on The Hobbit. I had a lovely time on The Hobbit because Peter was so generous to me, and it wasn't quite as it wasn't as thrillingly everyone in it together as it was
Yeah.
in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it seems like, Lord of the Rings, everything you hear is, a little bit of the ragtag team, trying to pull off the impossible, and then you don't get that same sense from The Hobbit, just from hearing stories and background information and stuff like that. So about the as a fan, it was kind of one of those exciting moments, like, oh, we're gonna get a third Hobbit film, and then you're excited, but then you're also kind of thinking, wait, does that work? How does that work? We've already had one film released. So what do you know of the background information on the decision to go from 2 to 3 films?
Um, and there's been a lot written and said about
Mm-hmm.
whose decision it was, and was it merely a cynical financial decision to have 3 blockbusters and make even more
Mm-hmm.
money. I get the sense that I think there was an honest desire from Philippa Boyens, Fran Walsh, and Peter Jackson with the scripts they had. They
Mm-hmm.
they had a lot of things to get in, and they were struggling to get it all in.
Yeah.
Because they filmed so much, and that was what
Mm-hmm.
they'd done with Lord of the Rings. And they thought, well, what happens if we move all this stuff into a third film?
Yeah.
And they just bounced it off Warner. I don't think they were completely committed to it. They went over and said, how do you feel about third film?
Mm-hmm.
And I think at that point, Warner, they started doing the calculations in their head,
Yeah.
and lawyers got involved. And, well, if we do this and need a bit more money to finish it, and I need this, and well, hold on, we have another trilogy. Hollywood's a business
Mm-hmm.
in the end.
Yeah.
And so they're always going to have that attitude towards things. That gets the share price up. That does all the
Right.
things for you.
Yeah.
I don't think Peter Jackson thought he was sort of being cynical.
Right.
Or I don't get no sense that he did it, entirely anyway for financial reasons.
Oh, no.
Maybe
No.
he was being a bit, overly confident that this material would stretch out and there would be enough of it. And I get the sense, certainly with the third film, that he's almost sort of throwing in big moments to fill it out a bit.
Fill it, yeah, the runtime, yeah.
To find the film, which maybe he didn't need to do. I have quite a lot of affection for the middle film, Desolation of Smaug. I think some great stuff in Desolation of Smaug. I think from the point when they enter the kind of Mirkwood right through to the dragon stuff, I think it's upbeat in terms of the tone, and it's lighter maybe than Lord of the Rings, but it has that kind of energy to it that I really like. So in a sense, I kind of wish they'd done 2 and they had all that kind of the whole second film had been like Desolation of Smaug right through to a battle at the end.
Yeah.
It was problematic ultimately because maybe the films didn't bear the weight, each one of enough story. But I don't think it was exploitation as it's been written about.
Yeah.
I also think they were trying to find a way to give these films that kind of weight and epic quality that Lord of the Rings have. They were trying to find a way of turning the thin book that is The Hobbit into the big fat book that was Lord of the Rings, and brought in all the kind of backstories and the necromancer stuff.
Yeah.
All these things. And I think with a lot of pressure from the studio to do so. And I think that was harder to make sense of. In the end, to me, Lord of the Rings is just a much, much better book than The Hobbit. I love The Hobbits.
Yeah.
But it's much better Lord of the Rings.
Oh,
There's so much more to it.
Like you said, they're totally different. Yeah.
Yeah. It's vast, and you have so much richness. The great thing, actually, fundamentally with Tolkien is he writes great set pieces for movie makers. It's really visual stuff that Tolkien comes up with. The flight to the Ford, the fight with the Balrog, going to Lothlorien, Death of Boromir, all these things. There are fantastic movie beats that are provided by Tolkien. And they come again and again and again in Lord of the Rings. You have to, you go through a chapter, then Shelob turns up, and all you got to say, my God, this stuff keeps coming on. We haven't even got to Mordor yet.
Yeah.
And it's just fantastic. And with The Hobbit, there isn't. There's some great moments, great set pieces, but they're kind of glancing in the writing.
Yeah, they're much smaller to,
Yeah. The Battle of the Five Armies, in fact, it doesn't happen in the book. Bilbo's knocked out and he wakes up and it's done.
And they're like, oh yeah, there was a war while you were asleep.
Which is funny in the book, but of course when you come to the film, you're like, we can't have that. So we have to invent this vast battle and put all these things in it. So they were forced in a way to sort of go beyond the bounds of Tolkien.
Yeah.
And that creates problems for them, because actually the best guy at this is Tolkien.
Right.
The best guy at these moments
Yeah.
is Tolkien. And
Hmm.
when Tolkien hasn't given it to you, you're struggling a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, because I mean, in the end, who can do Middle Earth as well as Tolkien? Nobody,
Nobody.
But yeah, you're absolutely right, which is why, I've always argued against anytime someone says to me, oh, well, they made one book into 3 movies. I'm like, there's so much else that goes on. The Hobbit is such a light and breezy thing. It was never going to work as The Hobbit is, unless it was a totally tonally different. Yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't gonna work. Bringing in the necromancer stuff, it all made sense if you're going for that Lord of the Rings grandiose tone. And there's no way you're not going to show the Battle of Five Armies in an adaptation of The Hobbit. It's too important to the overall story of Middle Earth.
Yes, absolutely. But it was always, Christian Rivers, who went on to direct Mortal Engines, who was very important as a kind of behind the scenes guy in Rings. He always said it's like you're serving the starter after the main course, with The Hobbit, and you're always going to be struggling.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be fascinated to know what the Del Toro version might have been like, and maybe it would have been significantly different tonally because it was just his version, and he has that kind of slightly sarcastic tone of voice in his films that might have given us something different, and he would have done 2 films. And I mean, who's to know? It might have been awful. It might have been a complete disaster. And all the things that are good about The Hobbit might have been lost. So, I think they're not as good as Lord of the Rings. Then very few films are.
Yeah.
But I think if you just look at them as sort of fantasy movies, they're pretty decent fantasy movies compared to 80% of other fantasy movies.
Yeah.
I think there's some really good stuff. There's some astonishing special effects, and I think Martin Freeman is terrific. You get Ian McKellen, who's just effortless, just doing that stuff, and you get a great dragon. You get a great dragon for your money, turning up, and I like that sequence with the dragon.
And Thorn. I mean, Richard Armitage, like the Thorin stuff with his descent into madness, and I mean, it's very Shakespearean. He just knocks it out of the park with his performance. I felt like, especially in Battle of Five Armies.
Yeah, I think he really gives a good performance. I thought they worked very hard to create characters within the dozen dwarves. Which is a hard thing to do. 12 characters.
Yeah, it's honestly one of the things I wish we would have seen a little more of over the 3 films is the characters of the dwarves. I've read through some of the behind the scenes books, and you learn, chatting with Jed Brophy here on the channel, talking about Nori. He tends to steal stuff. We see a little bit of that in Rivendell, but there might have been other opportunities to show that, and the relationships between the brothers and cousins in different groups. It's one of the reasons why I always watch the extended Battle of Five Armies, is for one of my favorite moments when Beaufort and Bilbo are on the wall, when Bilbo's sneaking out with the Arkenstone. And there's some great character moments, like you said, and some great casting. It seems like no matter what they're doing in Middle Earth, especially in Lord of the Rings, but even in The Hobbit, the casting is fantastic.
Yeah, they're very astute in sort of measuring role to actor. And I mean, one of the key things that Jackson always said about, especially when they were doing Lord of the Rings casting, was that not only have to you find the right person for the role, you have to find the right person for the shoot. Someone who's going to be able to survive 18 months and keep it up and stay happy and not be a pain. They don't want Marlon Brando at the top of a mountain. I'm not in character. They don't. You can't deal with that. Plus, the Kiwi mentality doesn't deal with that anyway.
Wouldn't jive.
Why are they showing up? They're showing up all this kind of nonsense. And they didn't get any of it because everyone threw themselves into it with absolute passion. And sort of totally bought into the environment that New Zealand gave and Jackson gave. in Viggo Mortensen's case, almost to the point of madness, where he actually thought he was in Middle Earth at times, and he was so devoted to the whole project. But that was kind of just astute casting in terms of they looked at people and sensed something about them. They thought, right, you'll be all right to be on this trip with us, this journey with us. You're the right kind of person, which is one of the reasons I think Stuart Townsend was famously fired from the very beginnings of Lord of the Rings as Aragorn, because he wasn't on the same wavelength. He was too young for the role, and I think Jackson knew that. But he was just his attitude, I think. He wasn't difficult, but he was just unhappy. And they could see that. And they thought, how can we do 18 months with this most enormously important of characters? And this guy's depressed already 2 weeks in. So I think it was key. And that's true of The Hobbit as well. You needed to find people who would have a ball as much as they were professional and enjoying it. And they're all very different. I love the fact that Martin Freeman was so polar opposite to like Elijah Wood and Orlando Bloom, the guys who were like, I'm having the New Zealand life, I'm surfing and riding and partying and having the best time of my time. Martin Freeman was like, no, job's done, go home, have a cup of soup, go to bed. New Zealand can be where New Zealand is. I'm totally British, and of course that's much more Bilbo than it is Frodo. So there was a great sort of tuning fork for people who would work.
So I wanted to ask, I was curious, what's your favorite story from your time covering the production of Middle-earth films and covering Peter Jackson?
This is so hard because there was so many wonderful moments, crammed into. I think I was on a set, Two Towers supplementary shoots probably for 5 days, but you do lots of different things. So it's not like you're standing by a camera for 5 days. You're with the special effects people for a bit, and you're traveling around. And then I was about a bit longer. I was on Return of the King, and it was so fantastic. I have a great memory of absurd things. I say the orcs. Sorry, cat's moving in front of the camera now. The orcs kind of drinking, and I had this lovely memory of queuing up for food on the catering table. And there were kind of 2 queues and a table down the middle of the 2 queues. And for some reason, I end up opposite Christopher Lee. I'm on one side of the table and he's on the other side, fully clothed as Saruman. The beard is kind of held up in a net, but the rest of it, talons are still on, all of it. And we kind of stop. And there's a bowl in front of us, a steaming bowl of something. And he kind of looks at this bowl and he looks up at me and goes, what do you think it is? And I think, well, I think it's a bowl of chili, Sir Christopher. Trying to, and he's, and he sort of, better not, on set this afternoon. And off he goes. And I'm saying, oh, wow. Then I realise afterwards, he thinks I'm catering. He thinks I'm there to serve him this kind of thing. And it was full of things like that. I got to know, I think above all, I got to know Peter very well, and I earned his trust. And he was wonderful to me in terms of what he opened up for me on the set and on the Hobbits. And subsequently, when I came to write the book, he opened up archives and he gave me a lot of his time. And that to me was just fantastic, and he's a fascinating guy and an interesting guy and a very humble guy. He sort of sees into the absurdity of filmmaking, and I try to get some of that out in the book. That it takes that kind of thing to make the Lord of the Rings. Because I think Tolkien was kind of a humble guy. He never bought into the showiness. I mean, he hated all the adulation that came his way. And I think that they were kind of alike in that respect. But just endlessly wonderful moments. Just meeting hobbits and I can remember all the Hobbit extras kept wanting to be interviewed. So you'd be standing by catering, sort of waiting to go on set or waiting for the next thing to happen. And all these kind of hobbits would come up to you dressed in the gear and go and introduce themselves and go, I'm from Whakanui and I'm actually a tax collector in real life and I play this hobbit and this is my motivation. And I'm thinking this, you're like, I'm not sure I can do anything with this, but very nice to meet you. And I have a great memory of, a particular memory of one scene, which is the scene where Sam hits Gollum with the frying pan. Gollum is gazing into the water
Yep.
having a sort of conversation with himself, and he's caught out by Sam in his plotting, and he hits him with the frying pan. This wakes up Frodo, and there's a great big sort of tumult that goes on. And I was there for a part of that, obviously, which was a quite involved sequence. And I just remember going on set, and Fran Walsh was directing that second unit. Jackson was obviously off doing something very important somewhere else. There were lots of second units and third units, and it was just brilliant because Andy, in his kind of leotard, was having a very intense discussion with Fran Walsh about the nature of the scene. Elijah Wood was sound asleep, in character on the ground, having a nap.
Yeah.
And Sean Astin, because Sean Astin is like this, decides he needs to talk to the journalist and comes out and is kind of holding court. He has the backpack on, he has everything, frying pan. And he's going, well, and he does these kind of lots of kind of big gestures. He talks big, Sean Astin, like a politician. And it's just this fantastically surreal kind of tableau of Lord of the Rings making. Elijah Wood asleep, and Andy Serkis and Fran Walsh deep in kind of concentration on some kind of Gollum technicality, and Sean Astin talking about motivation and acting and America versus New Zealand. And it was just like, this is the best place in the world to be. This is brilliant.
That's amazing. So obviously we mentioned before you've covered a range of directors. We mentioned Ridley Scott, Tim Burton, Quentin Tarantino. What distinguishes Peter Jackson? What's different or special about Peter Jackson compared to his peers?
I think one fundamental thing is that goes back to the kind of New Zealand spirit and the nature of what people in New Zealand are like, and they're much more pragmatic. It's something to do with being at the end of the world, and they've been sort of left to their own devices for hundreds of years. So if machinery breaks down, they just have to figure out a way of mending it, because it would take too long to get a replacement in from the old world. So this is kind of can-do spirit. It's what took them to the top of Everest first with Edmund Hillary. He was a Kiwi, and there's Everest, we'll get to the top of it. That's kind of a Kiwi attitude, without fuss. And I think Jackson is sort of embalmed in that spirit. So he doesn't have any pretension at all. And not that Quentin Tarantino or Ridley Scott have pretension necessarily, but they are people much more attuned to Hollywood, and in their dealings with you as a writer are much more Hollywood-like. Whereas Jackson's never been like that. He's been completely open and honest, and he's one of the few filmmakers I think get the writer and get what you're doing and like what you're doing, and enjoying the kind of the relationship you're having, because he grew up reading film magazines, and he grew up reading film books, and he was a geek, and loved toys and model making and fantasy movies and Ray Harryhausen and all those things. And he's still that big kid. He was this big kid with this kind of massive movie set and this massive sort of filmmaking
playground
world around him. That he has at his kind of disposal. And I think that makes him different. There's a kind of an openness and honesty about him that might make him vulnerable in some ways to, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that came with The Hobbit. And I think maybe they hit him hard. And he came out of that a slightly depressed guy, after the Rings and the adulation that followed. And I think he took Hobbit quite hard because he'd worked so hard on it and tried so hard. He's an emotional guy like everyone else, but he's a terrifically dry sense of humor that sometimes you're not sure he's being funny, and you have to kind of go, oh, it's a joke. It is a joke. And you're like, okay. He drinks gargantuan amounts of tea. And if you're interviewing him over a long period of time and you try and keep up with him, your bladder will burst, because he has somehow got the biggest bladder of anyone I've ever known. Never wears shoes, as everyone knows. Is slightly scruffy and determinedly scruffy, and just is sort of monumentally himself, and can't ever change that. I don't think he sees himself as a great artist, but he is. And it's because he doesn't see himself as a great artist that makes him work.
And you mentioned, you kind of touched on the kind of affecting him, the criticisms thrown at him after The Hobbit. And I fully acknowledge, I'll admit all day, I prefer Lord of the Rings over The Hobbit. I feel like they're better films. I don't think anyone argues that. It's hard to compare anything to Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit was always facing an uphill battle. And I now, with the with hindsight being what it is and knowing more behind the scenes that we didn't maybe know at the time, I have so much more appreciation for what he's done across the 6 films. And the fact that we even have a Hobbit at all is because Peter Jackson took it upon himself to do it. And I really hope that, I've kind of been a Peter Jackson evangelist to those who, have a more pessimistic view of The Hobbit than I do. But I kind of liken it a little bit to what a lot of fans think of George Lucas now. When the prequels came out, people were kind of hard on him, so much so that he ends up selling Star Wars. And now we've had some films under Disney, and their reception has been what it is. And I feel like a lot more people are like, yeah, we had it pretty good with George Lucas, actually. And I hope that I think by and large, people love Peter Jackson, and I hope that that he knows that the vast majority of the fans are appreciative of everything that he's done.
I'm sure he does. I'm sure he is very much at peace. I think he's very much enjoying doing documentaries at the moment.
Yeah.
I think he's
some amazing documentaries too.
And using his understanding and intuition about way special effects work and applying them to factual subjects is a radical new way of going about sort of recreating history, discovering and opening up history. I think his Beatles documentary is probably going to be, I think it's going to be a smash hit.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to that one.
I don't think people realize quite the devotion to the Beatles that there is.
He loves the Beatles. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think he's in a very good place as a filmmaker. I'd love to see him make a feature film again, whatever it may be. I think he's very much at peace that Middle Earth is behind him. And he did Lord of the Rings, and it was an extraordinary achievement. And he did The Hobbit, and that in his own way was an extraordinary achievement. He's got it all done. I think I spoke to him, I think, Mortal Engines time. And we spoke about the Amazon series, and he said I was interested in terms of just having a look at the scripts, but he said the deal was, what wasn't the way I wanted to work. If he got involved, it would be everything cleared through the estate, everything cleared through Amazon. And he said he had probably had memories of The Hobbit all over again and Warner, and he said I'm not going back down there. You either give it to me and we work out between us what we're going to do with it. It's going to be our baby, or I'll let it go and I'll watch it at some point down the line. So I think he's very much at peace as regards that. I think he's still very responsible for Weta and making sure the work is coming in. Of course, they're doing Avatar 2 and 3 and 4, and they're very busy. So there's lots of work. And I hope he'll discover some story he wants to tell, sort of feature film wise, quite soon. I'd like to see him do Bad Taste 2. I'd be overjoyed if he went back and did like a splatter horror movie, but with all the kind of mods and cons he can bring to it. With his money now, I think that'd be brilliant.
That would be interesting. A big budget splatter horror movie. So you mentioned, obviously we have the Amazon show on the horizon. There's actually a part in the very back of your book. I looked ahead a little bit. Like I said, I'm not quite there yet, but you do mention, that's on the horizon. From someone who's obviously had a lot of experience with Peter Jackson's films, what are kind of your thoughts and expectations with the Amazon show?
Well, it's funny. When I wrote the afterward, we put it in right at the kind of bitter end of the whole production schedule in the book. We rather expected it to be out here
by now.
It's almost been done by now. We were kind of a bit worried that it was going to arrive and the book didn't mention it. So it's probably a little bit naive now because we hadn't heard a lot about it and we were still sort of speculating on what it might be. I'm a bit sort of split, I suppose, like most people and most fans. I am absolutely, like my old Empire days, hoping for a great series. I'm hoping for a great piece of sort of fantasy storytelling that sort of uses the great tools and the great countryside of New Zealand and the great kind of world that was created by Tolkien very well. But at the same time, I'm quite worried and skeptical. I'm skeptical because it's going to suffer a little bit from the problem that the hobbits, the big expanded hobbits faced,
Yeah.
is that you're not actually doing Tolkien. You're inventing ersatz Tolkien.
Right.
You're using the basis in the world, but you're not doing Tolkien.
Yeah.
And really, Tolkien delivered 2 novels and one sort of collection of folk stories, sort of history, which is the Silmarillion, which they don't have the rights to. So it's not that.
Right.
They're doing sort of a little bit, taking out one of the appendices and sort of extrapolating exponentially
Yes.
from about 3 paragraphs, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
That worries me, and so it won't be in my head the same as Lord of the Rings. And they're calling it Lord of the Rings television, but it isn't that.
Yeah.
Because I knew that book. I knew what a compelling story it was. So I couldn't wait for it to be made as a film. I don't know what to expect from Amazon, really. I think it's from, you probably know more than I do, but what I gather, it's a second age story.
Second age, yeah.
So automatically my thinking is like, well, hold on, isn't the kind of the funny hobbits and quirky wizards stuff going to be ditched and jettisoned because that's not in that age?
Yeah.
And isn't that the kind of main selling point of Middle Earth for many people who don't know the books?
Right.
It's hobbits and wizards. So if that's gone, what are we left with?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've basically got, we have Numenor. There's a possibility we could get the blue wizard, so we could have some wizards, but that you're right, that hobbits, if they're sticking to Tolkien's timeline, there's no hobbits in the second age that we know of.
Yeah, which makes it grand, doesn't it? It makes it a bit more, I suppose, Game of Thronesy, as you said earlier.
It's probably more like that prologue feel to Lord of the Rings is probably what they're hoping to capture is that high history, history of Middle Earth kind of thing. I
don't know. I think you run in risk of it becoming pompous. And Jackson always said, his great terror, in making Lord of the Rings was pomposity, and it would become ridiculous, pretentious. And he, and the way he got around that was he put a humor into Lord of the Rings. They found it, naturally. It came out of the Hobbits. It came out of Gimli. It came out of the Wizards. Gandalf was very funny.
Yeah.
And all the characters actually have the comedy moments, which leavens it, lightens it all.
Yeah.
And he got out of actors like Ian Holm and Ian McKellen and Christopher Lee a kind of authenticity in the lines. They made it real. These kind of mad things they were talking about. If you never read Tolkien, remember that Flame of Undun and all that kind of stuff. The confrontation of the Balrog, on page, that is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
But coming out of Ian McKellen's mouth, it's wonderful. You're like, this is magic.
Yeah.
And the danger for me is that you're just going to be a bit stiff, and it's just going to be a bit fantasy 101 again. Big kingdom versus big kingdom, evil army trounces good army, and the kind of the intimacy that's there in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit even might get lost. I don't know. I imagine they're thinking these things themselves, and they're not stupid people, these creators.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They're going through all this kind of nightmare in their heads, going, well, what is important, what is vital to anyone to feel that this is Tolkien's world?
Yeah.
It's not just elves who can be a bit arch and remote as characters. So what's going to make them funny? What's going to bring a bit of human quality to it?
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised they're wrestling a bit, and they're trying things and ditching them and bringing new people in.
Yeah, I know they're recently, like you said, they're not, these are smart people, and they understand. There's certain things that you would imagine they would, understand. Like I know, a lot of people got fired up when, people were reporting like, oh, they want it to be like Game of Thrones, and obviously that blew up. Like you said, it's accessible. It's on the internet nowadays. Like that just gets blown up into all these different directions. And I'm just kind of sitting here thinking like, we haven't seen a trailer yet. We've not seen footage. Like maybe we should calm down just a little bit. But I look at it and think, Amazon is obviously invested a lot. They are very invested in making this a series that people will like. And, it would kind of be shooting themselves in the foot if they immediately said, what's the opposite of what, Tolkien fans would expect. Let's do that,
Yes, yeah. I think they've ended up in New Zealand, and that tells you straight away that they know they need some kind of spiritual connection, if nothing
Yeah.
else, with the Lord of the Rings films.
Yeah.
I mean, they're within their rights to directly link them,
Mm-hmm.
to clarify that this is the same world as the world of
Yeah.
Frodo and Sam and Gandalf. And I imagine they would do that. I would do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a young Elrond has been
Mm-hmm.
rumored, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a
And
through line.
Galadriel. Yeah.
Galadriel. So that makes sense. It's a kind of tone thing that's going to be hard to capture, because the films, rather than the books, have Jackson's directorial tone of voice in
Mm-hmm.
them, and his way of shooting and creating humor and adventure in films. The lovely kind of swooping camera work and all those kind of things. His great sort of absorbing of the widescreen.
Mm-hmm.
There's a style there, and it's, are you going to try and do that, or are you going to kind of go for the kind of grittier kind of Game of Thrones realism, the kind of the idea of almost a medieval world that's historical? But again, you're going to have trouble, aren't you, because you've got elves and kind of big flights of fantasy that are in. If you take the Silmarillion as a measure of what the films might be like, or the series might be like, then it's big stuff. It's like Greek myth stuff. It's kind of epic. So they've got a lot of sort of wrestling of things to do to get it under control. And even more than the Hobbit, they're going to have prying eyes on them. The internet.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Even like you said, even more than the Hobbit. I think anytime, gosh, I feel like it's breaking news if the official Amazon Lord of the Rings account sends out a tweet or something.
Yeah,
it's like breaking news. What are you currently working on now, or is it kind of secret? Do you have another?
So it's very terrifying, actually. When you write books and you have deals with publishers, you kind of get going on your book, and then they put it up on Amazon, and you're like, I've got 2 chapters in, and it's already for sale on Amazon.
Sorry,
like,
pre-order.
Whoa! I start typing all the faster. It's. I'm sort of not. I did at one point talk to Peter about maybe another Lord of the Rings book. I got the sense he didn't want to. I think he was wanting to put it behind him. I had this idea of doing one about the actual shoot. I was going to do a day-by-day account. It was about the most microscopic version you could do, so it's like a diary, but it was literally every day. And I've got all the kind of call sheets. He gave me access to all the call sheets of every day, and they sort of tell a little story, each call sheet. Stuff about, at the end, there's always lost and found. It's like, if you left their Wellington boots on set last week, then it's like, there's a party on Saturday, Vigo's leaving party. It's just lovely little details. And I was going to try and then sort of connect it to the outside world and see what was going on in the real world while all this was happening. And I just got the sense he thought that would be too much of a workload, and was doing his documentaries. And so maybe one day we can come back to that. But in the meantime, I've just finishing a book on Guillermo del Toro that fits in with my series that includes Tim Burton and Quentin Tarantino. And I'm working on a book on the Coppolas, the great filmmaking dynasty, which is a very different kind of story, a different way of doing a film book. It's a very because you're traveling over a lot of time and a lot of different films, and you've got the Godfathers and Apocalypse Now. So you've got these huge stories within it, and it's a sort of a story about film culture and the way it changed. Obviously everyone knows Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, but just within the context of Coppola, it's very interesting, who he was and what drives him. He's still alive, so he's not gone anywhere. But and then who was his filmmaker? So
and now his daughter. It's his daughter, right? Is it his daughter Sophia?
Yeah, his daughter. Yeah. So she now is almost the bigger Coppola. He's 80, and she's now the kind of the more famous Coppola, and in what way she is kind of like him, or what way she's different from him. And she grew up on all the movie sets. She was the baby in the Godfather. She was 4 years old in the Philippines while they were shooting Apocalypse Now.
Wow.
So she's lived that life firsthand. So that as a filmmaker, she's full of that. Yet her films are very kind of dreamy and ethereal, and very different from his. A lot of her films, I think, are about hotels. And I think she's a girl who spent a life in hotels. You think about it, obviously lost in translation, but I think they're very The film's about being trapped in hotels and that being your entire world.
That's
May say
interesting.
something about her life.
Very fun. Oh man. Well, that's cool. Yeah, I'll look forward to those, and definitely, I hope that comes to fruition one day. The day by
Yes,
day of Lord of the
yeah.
Rings. That sounds really interesting to have that kind of glimpse.
It was quite a challenge to try to figure out. If you've got something like 240 something days, if you
Yeah.
include all the supplementary shoots, and if you did the miniature unit, it's something like 700 days. You
Oh
couldn't
my
do that.
gosh. Yeah.
And then you have to kind of keep a variety in your
Hmm.
story. So some of the entries I plan to be like no more than a paragraph.
Yeah.
It's a washout today. Everyone played
Yeah.
chess, like as little as that. And other ones would go on for pages because there would
Mm.
be debates about why Tom Bombadil's not in it. And
Oh
you
yeah.
could go off at sort of mad tangents,
Hmm.
but come back to the right. And the next morning, they were out in Queenstown, trying to do this, and the weather was being okay. I wanted this kind of
Yeah.
idea that it's dragged on and on and on. And
Wow.
somewhere in the outside world, governments are being elected and falling, and
Right.
life carried on.
Yeah. It is kind of crazy, how they were, like you said, it's, most people couldn't tell you where New Zealand was on the map at that time. It's so secluded, and they're just kind of off on their own, this band of people making one of the greatest cinema trilogies of all time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Separate from the world.
It's they were kind of in a cocoon in a way,
Yeah.
and it was so small. I mean, that's what when you went out there. Obviously, what they were creating was very big, but the actual fabric of it, the sets were fantastic, but the whole place was very small.
Yeah.
You walk out of one sound stage, and catering would be literally 10 feet in front of you with like corrugated roof, and everyone always raining, so you have to kind of dash between places to get to other places, and all very run down because it was a former paint factory. It still had the look of a former paint factory, and it was all so fantastic. I think that's what we didn't really say it, but one of the things that rather perturbed New Line was when they got there, they looked at this thing, they thought, what the hell? This is like a ramshackle old paint factory. How are we creating spending $200+ million? And this is where it's happening. They just couldn't get their heads around that. Where's the luxury? Where's the Hollywoodness?
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
they wouldn't spend any money on that.
So I usually do some kind of rapid fire questions toward the end here,
Okay.
to get your perspective on some of your favorite things. So what's your favorite character? And we can specify book. You obviously have read the book, so we could go with book and movie. If you want to take that easy road and pick one from each, that's totally fine. There's no rules here. So who's your favorite Tolkien character?
I try and do them separately. I'll do in terms of the books. I loved Aragorn, especially. I love Strider. I loved Strider before he became Aragorn. He was, because he was the ranger, and he was wild and a bit ambiguous and enigmatic, and he has a great entrance. And I loved Sam as well. Sam, he was always my kind of. He was kind of for me. He was the protagonist. It's that reading of the books where actually it's Sam's story.
Yeah,
and because he's the ordinary guy, and Frodo is the kind of more heroic idea. So Sam and Strider are the two favorite, and a bit of Faramir as well late on. In terms of the films, it kind of changes. It's like my argument about why Friends as a sitcom is so good is that you can watch it with the attitude that each one of them is the funniest one, and you're right every time. If you think Phoebe's the funniest one in Friends, and you watch it with that in mind, Phoebe's the funniest one. Ross is the funniest one. Watch it again and just think that Ross is always the funniest one. Every one of them is the funniest one. Yeah, that's why it's brilliant. And in a way, the films of Lord of the Rings have that quality. The best one is Pippin. Watch it. The best one is Pippin, and you're like, he's brilliant, Pippin. It's the Pippin story. But I would really, because Andy has become a friend and someone who's helped me out a lot, and I think achieved something both as an actor and as a kind of scientist and creator with Gollum that fulfilled the promise of the books in that character, created a life for that character, which is vital to the storytelling and what makes him something more grown up than other fantasy stories. He's
Yeah.
Gollum, and obviously just achieved something that was transforming for an industry as
Mm-hmm.
well. So Gollum, I would go for with finally is my movie
Yeah.
character.
That's a great answer. Yeah, I've often thought, there's kind of this thing with awards in Hollywood. The motion capture performances, even though they've you know turned into this huge pivotal thing in the industry, they never get any awards love. And I've always thought, if you're not going to nominate them, then at least create a new category and call it the Andy Serkis Award for, digital performance or something. Because it's hard to, I mean, it's got to be up there with, some of the all-time, most significant changes to the industry.
I think just think about it as an acting challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he has huge monologues that are duologues. Basically, he has scenes with himself.
Yeah.
And he had to create basically two separate characters that were still somehow the same character,
Mm-hmm.
and not show the joins. So you're never entirely sure at what point Smeagol gives way to Gollum and Gollum comes back into Smeagol.
Yeah.
The border is blurred.
Mm-hmm.
And that's brilliant. That's kind of, and you'll never, and he said what's vitally important to how he portrayed Gollum is that you don't know whether the real person is Gollum or the real person is Smeagol.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know who the true, because it's both. It's a mix of them both, and that was a really sophisticated idea in terms of characterization on a screen. How you create this character and to be funny and to do a lot of really good comedy stuff in the film. And at the same time, to have to do scenes twice and wear a leotard and figure out all this kind of motion capture stuff and work with the animators.
Mm-hmm.
And he far more than just an actor on those films. He was he was an absolute collaborator in the creation of that character.
Absolutely, yeah. It's hard to imagine anyone ever topping his Gollum for sure.
Yeah.
All right. So, of Tolkien's works that you've read, which book is your favorite?
Well, I mean, it's Lord of the Rings as a whole is the great story. I mean, it's just a monument to storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's derided in many circles and not seen as literature. All these people attack it, but they don't understand the fundamental power of how compelling a piece of storytelling it is. For a 14-year-old to read 1,000 pages is a miracle.
Right.
And that comes down to the fact that Tolkien is extraordinary in just the texture and the suspense, the way he builds up fear and terror. And as I was saying before, there's wonderful set pieces, there's wonderful visualized events. The reason we talk now about this, and there's been these great films and all this, is in the end, Tolkien's imagination.
Yeah.
And so Rings is the great book for me. I always liked Two Towers as the one as amongst the three.
Yeah.
I think I liked it because when it still had, I like the divided form, and I know that you couldn't do that on film; they had to kind of edit them together. But I liked about you got one half of the story, the Aragorn, Legolas part, Gimli part, and then you got the other part, the Frodo and Sam bit. And I like the fact we kind of switched halfway through, and each one built up to an incredible finale.
Yeah,
and the suspense involved in Two Towers, you build up to Helm's Deep, and then you build up to Shelob's Lair, and all of that.
Yeah,
that's just fantastic. So within Lord of the Rings, it probably still is the Two Towers.
Yeah, it's funny, explaining to people, oh yeah, well, the Lord of the Rings, it's one book, but it's divided into 3 books, and each book has 2 books, and it's a little bit like the old bit of, in the United Kingdom, how many countries are in this country? As an American, it's kind of like, oh, okay. I feel like I give that to people in the sense of Tolkien's books as well. So favorite book. What is your favorite of the Middle Earth films?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I'm now, like most people, married to the extended cuts of the Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely.
I haven't watched the theatrical cuts for a long time, so I'm not sure I even remember which bits were not in the theatrical cuts anymore. So what would I go? I don't know. Again, I vacillate a bit. I do love the extended cut of the Two Towers. I think it's the one that gained the most from the kind of being moved on. I think bits of it really kind of expanded out the whole mythology very well. So
Mhm.
I really love that version. But I think Fellowship is a wonderful piece of just more old-fashioned,
Yeah.
epic kind of men on a mission
Hmm.
kind of fantasy storytelling. There, it
Yeah.
has a much more linear path
Right.
and has a great emotional finale to bring it to the death of Boromir, and that is just a great piece of just sort of classical filmmaking. So
Hmm.
I'm going to cheat a little bit and say Fellowship and Two Towers, extended editions,
Yeah.
but not to say I don't love Return of the King extended edition either, because that's great. But maybe the extended edition of Two Towers is the one
Mm.
that I think has the most texture to it in
Yeah.
terms of different things going on.
Yeah. That's a great answer. I know I think I've read Elijah Wood mentioning, with Fellowship, you have the advantage of, everyone's together. And
Yeah,
like you said, it's more linear story. And really, it was a perfect entryway into Middle Earth for people like myself who had no experience whatsoever. It's hard to top that first experience in Middle
yeah,
Earth. Um, excuse me. So here's a fun hypothetical question for you. So
yeah.
if you lived in Middle Earth, what what race would you be? Would you be a dwarf, elf, hobbit, man?
It's a good question, and I remember having good conversations with Dan Henner, who's the production designer on both
Mm.
of these. Lovely, lovely guy. He looks like a slightly older brother of Peter Jackson, big mad hair, lovely, gently spoken guy. And you can have really dense conversations with him about the fabric of Middle Earth. And we had a long conversation about shops and commerce.
Oh,
You know,
okay. Yeah.
where do you see shops? Who sells and where do they buy their food? If you live in Rohan, where are the shops?
Yeah.
He was very funny about it. In fact, the interesting thing is in The Hobbit, and when you get to Lake Town, they were actually quite conscious of showing you a much more kind of credible economy at work. You do see
Yeah.
shops and places.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll go with a place that needs shops and pubs. And so I will go with being a hobbit, because you get to go to the pub
Yeah.
and you get to go to parties, and you don't have to like join the army or anything and ride horses, any of that rather risky stuff. And you don't have to live for 10,000 years with your lovely blonde hair and
Right.
be an elf, where it looks quite dull. So I probably, like most people, I think I'd be a hobbit
Yeah.
and have one of those lovely little sort of Edwardian homes,
Yeah.
sit up, smoke my pipe in my front garden, and then watch the sunset, and then go to the pub in the evening. That sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. It's hard to beat that. As much I feel like as much as we would like to say, like, yes, I would be the one going on epic quests and fighting battles. It's like, no, we'd much rather just live in the Shire and eat and drink and smoke and all that. I did on a recent live stream. I had one of the best hypothetical questions that someone presented was, what would you, if you were opening a business in Middle Earth, what would it be? My answer was I would sell black arrows in Lake Town, and they brought up the point. Well, what if it's after Smaug died? And I'd said then they'd be souvenir black arrows, so you could have
You
one of
never
the
know when a
famous arrows.
dragon might come back,
Yeah,
just in
exactly.
case. A deterrent arrow.
So yeah,
I'd
it
get
sounds
into
like.
eagle wrangling. I would, if I can
Mm,
cut a deal with the eagles, then I cut out all that walking. We can
right.
win them over. Eagles. The great argument, like, why don't they just fly into Mordor on the back of an eagle and drop the ring? I would figure that out. I would create
Yeah,
Eagle Airwaves. And
Eagle Airways.
Eagle Airways, and we will flit about Middle Earth, like private jets.
Yeah,
They'll be in it. I give them a cut. Some
yeah.
top quality, meat to eat and
Meat.
raw,
Yeah, some
and
sheep. That's a really good one. I really like that. Man, we've got some good business ideas for Middle Earth here. Um, so you mentioned, you would be a hobbit living in the Shire. What would be your pick of a place to visit?
visit. That's a good one. If it's just a visit, then and I don't have to stay there too long, it's got to be the mines of Moria.
Mm.
And as long as we're at a time when they've cleared out, some of the bad elements, we've been in, we've removed all the kind of the
No
orcs and
Balrog.
goblins, no
Yeah.
Balrog, it's post all of that. because it's just, it's a wonder, isn't it? I mean, in terms of
Mm,
all those original artwork that were done, I always loved the ones of Moria, especially.
yeah,
Those endless winding stairways and this kind of idea of a labyrinth that's so complex you can never get your head around it.
yeah,
So I was always enchanted by the idea of Moria, and the way they do the kind of the Great Hall with the kind of the pillars is so spectacular. You'd want to see that, I think.
yeah. Yeah, I always wondered about the air quality in Moria, how they
Yes,
achieve that. You would think that it would be a little
a bit
stifling in there,
musty,
but
wouldn't it?
yeah, yeah. So as someone, this is it's not a rapid fire question, but it's something I thought about as someone who had read the books before. Obviously one of the biggest departures for the Peter Jackson films from the books is the scouring of the Shire not being part of the films, which from a filmmaking perspective is totally understandable. Was there a little part of you that was sad that the scouring of the Shire wasn't in there?
Um, I didn't especially miss Scouring of the Shire.
Mm.
Yeah, it was a great debate about Tom Bombadil and the
Oh
old
yeah.
forest and all that stuff. And it's kind of interesting because all that stuff's really really kind of good Tolkien stuff, because he hadn't really figured out where he was going with the story.
Hmm.
In a way, he sort of set off and writing Lord of the Rings, and you read the first few chapters, and they're very different to sort of post Elrond's Council,
Mm,
post all
yeah.
that stuff. So I think there's a kind of really weird sort of Tolkien-y world at the beginning that's
Hmm.
almost a little bit more like The Hobbit, and a bit more that says a lot more about him as an author,
Yeah.
and that slightly mystical, slightly
Hmm.
hippie-ish quality. Those chapters have a lot of songs,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's got a very different quality. So I understand fully why they had to kind of get rid of it, because
Hmm.
it breaks all the film rules.
Yeah.
You're not getting on with the story. It's
Right.
slowing it down, and it's
Yeah.
it's sowing confusion as well, isn't it? Who is this guy? How is he able to hold the ring and no one
Right.
else does? And what is his wife? Let
Yeah.
alone who is his wife? What is
Yeah.
she? So water spirit or whatever. But I love the idea of the tree that captures
Mm,
them, and all that. So a little bit of me was a bit like, I'd love to have seen something of that, but I
yeah.
totally get why it wasn't in
Hmm.
in the films. It made sense. Fog on the Downs, all that kind of rather eerie
Oh
stuff.
yeah. Yeah. I
It's
think
quite,
that's
yeah,
that the fog on the down, with the barrow wights. I feel
yeah,
like with Peter's experience with the horror stuff, I could
yeah,
see that being really amazing. I feel like, for all the Tom Bombadil lovers that were sad to see him go, I totally understood that, but there was part of me that would love to have seen Peter Jackson do Fog on the Barrow Downs.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it would have been very cool, that sequence. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's 1,000 pages, that book. You
Right.
gotta
Yeah.
you gotta
You got to,
dispense it.
yeah.
Yeah,
And it's one of those things, you kind of uh it kind of made the most sense to cut. It's a chunk of the book you can just remove, and it doesn't really change what
yeah.
comes after for the most part.
If they get to Bree, it's just like
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
travel, they're chased by black riders, they get to Bree.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
you need, and then we
Yeah.
meet Strider. So it's kind of that's the narrative moving forward,
Yeah.
not dallying around with strange woodland people and
It would just
spirits and going.
confuse the heck out of people who had not read the book. They'd be like, what was that? Who is this guy? It's like, oh, we're not going to talk about him anymore, actually.
But I suppose that Scouring of the Shire is an interesting one in the sense that it brings in another element in
Hmm.
that kind of idea of industrialization, and that's a kind of
Yeah.
form of evil that was
Hmm.
represented by Mordor, but is sort of exemplified by that chapter and Saruman, and that
Yeah.
would have been interesting. But
Hmm.
I get it, because you've got to finish this story at
Right.
some point. You've got to,
Yeah.
because everyone's a bit like, well, they've got rid of the ring, they've been
Yeah.
celebrated. Aragorn's got, sung at his own wedding, and it's all
Yeah.
happened. And now they're saying goodbye again and again. And,
Yeah.
we can't suddenly have another battle scene.
Right.
And
40,
Christopher Lee
45
turns up
minutes.
again.
Yeah.
We're like, oh my God, Christopher Lee's still there. But it would have been a television series. If it
Mm,
had been like Game of Thrones, that would have been a really nice idea to throw in
mm,
right at the end.
yeah.
Just that bit, like, oh God, he's not dead yet,
Right.
and and he's got a weird plan to take over Hobbiton. Yet
Hmm.
the hobbits are now totally able to deal
Yeah.
with him in their own right. They've changed. So
Yeah. It's kind of neat how, Saruman, he, you know, falls from the, not only being a great wizard, but he had these mighty ambitions of, getting the ring and he could control all Middle Earth, and it's like now he's reduced to just controlling the
Yeah.
Shire, the rural folk of Middle
Local
Earth.
industry in Hobbiton. Now he's just taking
Yeah.
over the mill.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And folks, the book, once again, Peter Jackson, if I can get in frame there, Peter Jackson and the Making of Middle Earth. Fantastic, fantastic book. A lot of great behind the scenes looks. Obviously, Ian reporting on his set visits and, the history of the production. It's, if you love Peter Jackson's movies, if you like Tolkien in general, you will definitely love the book. So yeah, Ian, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next time here on Nerd of the Rings.